Hola, ¿cómo están? Buenos días. Estamos empezando nuestra última charla virtual del año y les voy a presentar en nuestra charla de hoy, como todos saben, a la arquitecta Marion Weiss. Marion Weiss es cofundadora junto con Michael Manfredi del estudio Weiss Manfredi y es profesora en la Weizmann School of Design de la Universidad de Pensilvania. Su estudio está basado en New York, es una práctica multidisciplinaria conocida por integrar arquitectura, arte, infraestructura y paisaje. Algunos de sus proyectos más notables son el Parque de Esculturas del Museo de Arte de Seattle, que fue reconocido por la revista Time como una de las grandes maravillas arquitectónicas. Y su trabajo estuvo exhibido en la Bienal de Venecia, en la Bienal de San Pablo, en el Museo Guggenheim, el Museo de Diseño Cooper Hewitt, el National Building Museum y el Museum of Modern Art de New York. Ganó numerosos premios como el Leader Design Award de la revista Architectural Record en 2017 y su estudio también ganó el President's Award del New York Center for Architecture, el Cooper Hewitt National Design Award for Architecture y en 2020 la medalla de la Fundación Thomas Jefferson de Arquitectura. Y recientemente publicaron a través de Princeton Architectural Press una nueva monografía sobre el trabajo de su oficina que se llama Public Natures, Evolutionary Infrastructures. La charla de Marion va a tener una breve introducción en castellano de unos 2 minutos y después Marion va a hablar en inglés y como hacemos siempre en las charlas, yo voy a hacer una pequeña síntesis o una pequeña traducción. Así que me paso al inglés ahora. Weiss Manfredi's work has been very important for us for a long time now and has been a really interesting material of study because of the way it relates to some relevant questions for contemporary architecture. And some of these questions are, what is a contemporary way of thinking about public space, regardless of the scale of the project? What's the potential of public areas inside a building, and what is a public space in the city? Also thinking about movement through these spaces, and the way that they bring these ideas of public space and movement together makes work really special. So we've been studying your work for so long that it's a great pleasure to have you now with us, Marion. So welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Bueno, gracias, Tristan. Buenos días. Es un placer estar aquí hoy con todos ustedes. En primer lugar, me gustaría agradecer a CAT.DIEGUEZ y la Facultad de Arquitectura, Diseño y Urbanismo de la Universidad de Buenos Aires por esta invitación. Estoy encantada de poder participar, aunque sea de forma virtual, de la rica tradición arquitectónica de esta universidad, que desde 1985 ha ido creciendo con el fin de abarcar un terreno más amplio de las disciplinas que hablan de las posibilidades de combinar arquitectura, agricultura, paisaje, urbanismo y diseño gráfico. Hoy en día, que nuestros espacios sociales y naturales son cada vez más frágiles, es imprescindible reconocer que la arquitectura no es una disciplina aislada. Michael Manfredi y yo comenzamos nuestra práctica con un interés más allá de la concepción común que se tiene de la agencia de arquitectura. El nombre de nuestra firma, Weiss Manfredi Architecture Landscape Urbanism, refleja esa idea más transversal de diseño arquitectónico, uniendo cada una de estas disciplinas para crear un ámbito público más sólido. Para nosotros, la tensión entre el ideal y aquello circunstancial no nos es ajena, más bien al contrario, es la herramienta principal que nos articula nuestro proceso de diseño. Los lugares y programas que hemos encontrado más atractivos son aquellos que no tienen una definición nítida, fáciles y bien estructurados, sino aquellos que muestran desafíos y que han visto limitado su capacidad para formar parte del ámbito colectivo. Si bien muchos de los encargos no suelen encontrarse dentro de una disciplina clara, es este el punto característico del ámbito transversal y complejo en el que se desarrollan los proyectos de los hablaré a continuación. Gracias. Entonces yo voy a hablar en inglés ahora.
Thank you, Marion. That was great. Thank you.
Thank you. Entonces, breathing room, advocates, allies, and anomalies. The question for me and for my partner, Michael Manfredi, and I really has to do with the continuation and the strength of context and insights that have actually preceded us. What we feel is extraordinary is that your university has incredibly prominent alumni, Florinda Testa, Alicia Canzaniga, Alberto Preves, Diana Agras, Claudio Vextin, Thomas Saraceno, and the idea stretching urban ideas, architecture, and art together is really intrinsic in your university, which is very inspiring for us. But today we're in a strange time where there's many anomalies, and the absence of breathing room in some ways maybe is an opportunity to catalyze innovation. At your university, you all had constraints and restrictions that seem to have catalyzed a notion of breathing room in new and interesting ways. And that idea, that kind of public realm that is shared, becomes larger when we think about how fragile the world truly is. When we think about that fragility, it's coming into greater focus now with climate change. You look at the kind of flooding that we have been seeing increasingly, along with the kinds of fires, and the fragility of what we have at stake really makes us maybe think retroactively about various ideas of utopian urbanism. And you can say the idea of fortified protections in the Renaissance ideal city were always closed and enclosed, and the false fortifications even spread to ideas of temporary cities, working forces like Vila Piloto in Brazil. But we wonder whether the idea of fortification is so wise when we're trying to protect ourselves from external forces, and perhaps the artistic vision of a spiral jetty here might be a better model for thinking about embracing larger forces. So breathing room is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. The Oxford Dictionary definition says it's also considered breathing space, sufficient room to move and breathe comfortably. That's a simple definition. And Cambridge Dictionary says also breathing space, but it says a period of rest in order to increase strength or give you more time to think about what to do next. And arguably the pandemic, which took away so much breathing room, also created space or time to think about what we might project forward with. And so these anomalies, in some ways, you could say that the absence of breathing room sometimes catalyzes innovation. Think about the pandemics, which have really been part of our history, that has actually forged, if you will, larger ideas about what healthy practices might be. Still isolation, or the 40 giorni, 40 days, was the origin of quarantine for people who were traveling to avoid the spread of bubonic plague. But again, it's these ideas of tragedies sort of enabling the idea of innovation and the idea of light and air becoming law after there's various failures, and that expanding to larger ideas of urbanism and landscape and ecology coming into being here with Central Park, which was designed to be, with Frederick Law Olmsted's idea, an allusion to medicine saying we need lungs for the city too. And that breathing room for the city is one that has really forged an indelible relationship between high density urbanism and the opportunity for breathing room in our city. A preoccupation that I have been exploring along with my partner really is the question of what models are out there that have a DNA of complexity, like, if you will, if we look at Park Güell by Gaudí, Barcelona, we've been doing a series of drawings and studies to look at what multitasking infrastructures look like when they're open-ended and territorially expensive. This is a Kaju Bridge in Isfahan, and it is part a water retention and social infrastructure. And then Agrasan Kiboli in New Delhi, India, formerly a place of water gathering, but now a place of social engagement. And its idea of this sort of examination, and these are models done by my students at Penn, in part for exhibition at the Venice Biennale, was looking at the figure and the volume and the identity of spaces of multitasking infrastructure, both urban and architectural. So bringing this work to the Venice Biennale, we were invited to consider lines of movement in our work and in these infrastructural projects that have been originators of some of our ideas about multitasking infrastructures. And as we started to look at that, we wanted to create a space that had its own breathing room, where the dialogue between these sources of inspiration and our own work are seen not so much one-to-one, but in dialogue in the path of passage. And so constructing a setting or a room, literally breathing room, for these ideas to come together, brought these models and these investigations in dialogue with our own models, in this case of the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, as something that could be part of that journey that people take when they're walking through the Porgeri at the Biennale, where they could walk through and discover these sorts of ideas of public natures and multitasking infrastructures. Kristen, would you like to pick up a translation before I jump into the next section?
Yes, sure. Marion nos habla del espacio para respirar, breathing rooms. Ellos trabajan sobre el contexto y sobre precedentes, y ella rescata los precedentes de los personajes locales nuestros de la arquitectura, y sobre todo la idea de la relación entre arte y arquitectura, ¿no? Que es tan fuerte en muchas de las personalidades de la arquitectura argentina. Dentro de esta idea de espacio para respirar, que tiene que ver con la situación de cambio climático actual, y esto también podría pensarse como un tiempo para descansar y pensar qué hacer, que es exactamente lo que produjo la pandemia, ¿no? Nos dio un tiempo para reflexionar. Y esta ausencia a veces de espacio para respirar y de este breathing room o breathing space también puede disparar a la innovación. Ellos estudian las infraestructuras como el Parque Güell o infraestructuras públicas de New Delhi o de Islamabad, que son infraestructuras que sirven para muchas tareas a la vez, multitasking infrastructures. Y esta es una de las ideas más importantes, como que a través de ellas intentar generar como este espacio para respirar. Thank you.
Gracias. Entonces, advocates of LAs, the preoccupation of our practice has really been looking at these reciprocities, in some cases hyper-focused on connecting architecture and landscape to create a broader public realm, or breathing room, to invite a public in. And yet I'll share two projects to launch this preoccupation that are very, very tiny. One is for Novartis, a pharmaceutical company in Basel, where they were looking at their North America headquarters with new eyes and wondering whether their security entry was maybe not the right message for welcoming people onto their campus. And so we started to think about that larger question of what a gateway might mean on this kind of topographically diverse campus. And as a result, we started to think about really the fence or barrier that they had around the campus for important security reasons to be somewhat considered now as a place of passage and shelter. And as we started to look at that hybrid between passage and shelter, we could also imagine that as something at night to be some kind of a celestial soffit that would be a luminous expression of welcome for this campus. And it's a place where we can come in and what's been a kind of check through or checkpoint is now, in a sense, a place of respite and pause, also a place of passage. And when one is literally on what we call the land side, and is like an airport of airside and landside security, there's a place where you can wait to be picked up by the shuttle that can bring you through the campus. And again, though, that idea of what must be there as a fence for security is taking on a different role as a topographic separation, and one that actually stretches into the identity of the rest of the campus. Now, the idea of creating breathing room for innovative thinking at Yale University came into focus in a very different way. The engineering disciplines and computation and science at Yale are newer and, in a sense, less expressive of what the campus has wanted to be about, which is a place of exchange. In fact, the Marcel Breuer building on the left and the Collegiate Gothic on the right are buildings that hide a space that was underutilized. And here it was, Josiah gave a gift to say, let's create something incredibly transparent to welcome a cross-disciplinary place of new projects that don't actually fall into one disciplinary court or another. Our idea, like a painting by Magritte, was to say that maybe peeking through that place, a barrier, we could see a place of light, like a light bulb, where something that had been really the backyard of 1,000 buildings, and in no way a landscape of welcome, we could begin to think of as a place of connection and passage, and give legibility to this idea of connecting all these disparate engineering buildings, and take what had been a barrier done in the 1960s by Marcel Breuer between a collegiate Gothic courtyard and that rooftop deck, and actually connect them into something that would be a continuous landscape with a new landform to have an entirely transparent idea. And in this case, the curvilinear glass with a 22-foot free span by its curvature used the kind of engineering principle of strength through curves rather than flatness. So we were able to avoid any additional columns or mullions to support it. And if you look at that, it really is this idea of flexibility of a room that could be recast. And when the sun is bright or privacy is needed, this curtain can be drawn to create a more protective environment. And acoustically independent, but visually connected breakout spaces and conference rooms overlook that. But most importantly, we're proud of inventing a new landscape for the campus that nestles this kind of crystalline tempietto in the middle of the courtyard. What was most exciting for us, though, is that how do you make sense of all these different styles of history and contemporary work? And the curved glass in many ways takes the brutalist expression of Marcel Breuer's building on the right and turns it into something that nearly has the expressive capability of the Collegiate Gothic beyond where the president's office is. And so here it is finally at night. It really is a kind of hidden gem. Still, many people don't know about it, but it is a place where there's 24-hour activity and dialogues and grants being secured in ways that the university had hoped for. But this idea of science needing breathing room, and you think about the improbable simultaneities of the privacy of a laboratory and the publicity of a university, gets to the question that we were excited about working with the University of Pennsylvania on the Singh Center for Nanotechnology. And in this case, what's interesting is similarly, the engineering part of the campus was one that came later.
Marion, can I translate the Novartis and the Yale projects?
Sure, absolutely.
Sorry for interrupting. El primero de los proyectos, ella va a hablar de la manera en que arquitectura y paisaje pueden construir este nuevo breathing room. El primero es la entrada al campus de Novartis, que era un simple lugar de control. Entonces la pregunta es sobre qué significa una entrada. Y en vez de trabajar sobre la idea de separación, trabajar sobre la idea de pasaje de un lugar a otro y la idea de protección. Y que la separación entre el interior y el exterior se dé a través de la topografía y no a través de una reja. Entonces este edificio arma una transición entre las dos situaciones. El segundo proyecto, que es un edificio de ciencia para la Universidad de Yale en New Haven, está al lado de un edificio de Marcel Breuer, y de la misma forma que pasaba en el cuadro de Magritte, que uno ve una luz al fondo de un paisaje, buscaba aparecer, sacar la barrera existente del paisaje y generar nuevos circuitos y un nuevo paisaje dentro del campus. El edificio es totalmente transparente, tiene vidrios de 23 pies de altos, que serían unos 7 metros y algo nuestros, y para poder resistir sin como una sola pieza de vidrios, están curvados, y esto hace que la imagen sea totalmente transparente. Tiene cortinas en el interior, y lo más interesante es la forma en que estos vidrios curvos reflejan los edificios brutalistas alrededor y el contexto tan diverso de la universidad, del campus de Yale. Thank you, Marion.
Thank you, Tristan. The next project here coming up is looking at the advocates, anomalies, and allies that come together in a project like this, which was an amazing project. Eduardo Glant from Argentina, the Dean of Engineering at Penn, was as passionate about art as he was about engineering. And so when we looked at the opportunity here, we found that the site for the Penn Center for Nanotechnology didn't have any greenery, which had been so central to the development of the city of Philadelphia, but also to the identity of the University of Pennsylvania's campus. And as we looked at this site, which had been a parking garage, we realized that there was nothing about it that suggested it was part of the university. And existing at the edges, we wondered what might enable us to look at the kind of constraints of vibration, electromagnetic interference, which is problematic for nanoscience, and use that need to actually push parts of those laboratory spaces away from those interferences to create an opportunity potentially for unhinging the kind of conventional laboratory box, to create a space that could include landscape and places of collaboration that could actually form a new identity for the campus. And what's interesting here, and maybe hard to understand, is that it's very simple lab bars to our left and to our right. But the one element that didn't need vibration sensitivity tuned precisely was the place of gathering, which is that which is elevated to overlook the campus. And you can start to see that cantilever reaching out, but drawing you in. That engineering feat, if you will, is cantilevering on the right, but also hung on the left. So all these particular efforts are actually eliminating columns so that we could free up public space. That public space in the entry area confronts you with a wall of orange or saffron. And in this case, this color is needed in the glass to protect the nanoscience and protect it from the infrared lights that would destroy the research. And yet the people who are behind that glass now have a vista into the public area, into the landscape, so that their particular research and the engagement of people behind that wall can be shared, even though it need to be separate, of course, for the kind of clean room requirements. Because lab buildings are very tall from one floor to the next, and elevators need to be hidden very far away to avoid the vibration and electromagnetic interference, a staircase needs to become a destination in and of itself, because most people will need to use the stairs. So for us, in this very long hike, we created collaborative terraces on that staircase that connected each level. And similarly, we wanted to say that most scientists who tend to want to stay in their labs really need to be drawn together. And by being able to see and be seen, those vistas across these many floors creates a sense of a community that can convene finally at the very top terrace with an overlook of those chairs that overlook the campus and this room, if you will, which becomes very intimate while it's elevated over the campus and can actually capture vistas of the city. And so that kind of ascending topography of forms is also kind of a crystalline kind of chameleon with this externally acid etched glass. And we're also drawing light down into the lower level to enable landscape to be the convening element from the city all the way up to the terrace. And if I can put this in motion, for us, what's very interesting is it's both on an urban street, and it's also, in a sense, part of a place of convening. And that sense that people can both explore things in their labs, but also explore things at the edges and still be part of the city is, for us, the magic of this particular project. So
in this last image here, I think what we've loved is that finally engineering, which has tended to be very private and secretive in many ways because their labs haven't welcomed the community, this has become the kind of convening center for all the buildings that surround and have created a sense of public courtyard for engineering. Now, another question then is when infrastructure, architecture, landscape can become allies and for art in the public realm, those kinds of coincidences become very fraught, but if you will, very exciting when we think about them in a city. And in the city of Seattle, the museum there, Seattle Art Museum, had been very interested in making art free and open to the public. And yet there was no land to do so, to create a sculpture park in the heart of the city. In fact, the only land they could find was 3 different parcels separated by a highway, train tracks, a 40-foot grade change, a contamination because it had been Union Oil of California transfer facility, and a seawall which was deteriorating. And while it was a fraught piece of land, the ambition to create a park, in our case with the competition entry that we did, that would wander from the city to the water's edge, became really a question of simultaneities and, in a sense, asking 1,000 questions all at once to figure out how simple a form might be to answer everything from sustaining the momentum of the infrastructure to potentially even creating salmon habitat. So in this infrastructural X-ray drawing, we started to think about what we ultimately were fortunate to be able to do was to work with excavated land from a project downtown that had to pull earth out to be able to create parking. And we were able to take 200,000 cubic yards of earth to create this landform that could connect the city finally to its water's edge. And using highway construction techniques here, MSE or mechanically stabilized earth, we also created a series of concrete layered walls that are actually overlapping so that in an earthquake, they could still move around and not be damaged. But ultimately, it was about creating a topography that would enable art to have room to breathe and the community to have room to enjoy the Olympic sculpture park's vista, which are the Olympic Mountains, hence its name. But really the possibility of becoming a new destination, inventing, if you will, land that didn't exist and creating topographies that could actually filter these separations and offer something new. You can see here, we were interested in that kind of valley area that we invented to create a place that was somewhat more intimate. So Richard Serra's piece here, this great steel, Corten steel pieces called Wake, are protected within the valley, looking up at the pavilion. And yet, while it might be somber on one day, it could host a jazz concert on another day, particularly in the summer when Seattle doesn't have much rain at all. And inside, and this is a piece by wonderful Mexican artist Pedro Reyes, you can start to see the idea of these suspended cupolas and a mural being part of an ever-changing Kunsthal style art program that's really much more like a factory for art rather than the kind of privacy and preciousness of a museum gallery. And yet the building itself, the pavilion, in many ways unfolds just the same way that the landform of the earthwork does. And that earthwork is one that actually simultaneously enables you to drive into a garage on the left or ascend it to a crossing. And that crossing enables you to say that just as you're crossing the kind of highway overpass, that point is not something to conceal, but to celebrate. And in many ways, enable those on the roadway to know that they're crossing under something that is not a standard overpass, but something altogether different, with Calder's eagle in the distance. Or with, these incredible pieces here, the Vivarium by Mark Dion. We were fortunate to actually work with fantastic artists and collaboratively build this structure here to protect its nurse log. Literally a piece of nature brought from the forest and to the city to become a nurse log that would over 100 years fully deteriorate. Again, though, the simultaneity of all at once is what we're interested in, all at once and yet one at a time. The connections of art, landscape, trains. Here with Teresita Fernandez's work, Cloud Cover, we created a framework for her work where that Seattle cloud cover element could catch beautiful shadows on these walls and in conjunction with these aspens, create an ever-changing chromatic identity for this waterfront landscape. And just where the seawall was collapsing and the Army Corps of Engineers said we couldn't build on this piece of property, we were lucky enough to get, and here you see Jean Plens's work here, we were lucky enough to get finally a federal grant to build something that would enable us to take this parking lot down and actually pull back the earthwork and the resistance to create a new beach that has salmon habitat in mind. And in so doing, creating an earthwork, an intertidal earthwork that finally stabilized the seawall and provided salmon habitat. In fact, they're still monitoring it. You can see it at a midpoint here, proving that juvenile salmon are doing very, very well. And yet that real opportunity for us is looking at, again, this idea of an urban infrastructure that is at once a place of respite, a place of breathing room, and a place of ecologies to connect the human condition. So again, advocates, allies, and loose fit amplify peripheral vision. And I wonder, Tristan, do you want to translate before I jump in?
Yes, I was going to ask you. El primer proyecto es el Centro de Nanotecnología SING en Filadelfia, en un terreno en el que no había nada de verde y la mayor dificultad eran las vibraciones e interferencias que tenían que aislarse totalmente de los laboratorios. Lo que no necesitaba estar aislado eran todos los lugares de encuentro. Entonces ese es el foco del proyecto. Los lugares de trabajo se separan por vidrio para poder estar limpios y cumplir con todos los requisitos, pero ser a la vez transparentes y mostrar lo que pasa dentro. Y como los ascensores tienen que estar alejados de los laboratorios por las vibraciones, y los laboratorios son altos y las escaleras muy largas, inventaron como esta especie de terrazas colaborativas a lo largo de las escaleras, que hacen que toda la circulación sea una serie de lugares de encuentros y lugares desde donde ver, ser vistos y salir de los laboratorios para los científicos y poder encontrarse entre sí. El segundo proyecto es el Jardín de Esculturas del Museo de Arte de Seattle, que no tenía un jardín y el único terreno que consiguieron fueron 3 terrenos en el borde de la ciudad, separados por una autopista, por las vías de tren y por un muro de contención del mar muy deteriorado. Entonces, ellos diseñan una nueva topografía y un nuevo paisaje a partir de tierra, con técnicas de construcción de autopista. Hay un pabellón que es como una fábrica, que es el inicio del recorrido desde el lado de la ciudad, y después a través de este diseño se pasa por un valle, por distintas situaciones, hasta llegar a la costa. En el lugar donde se cruza con la autopista está la escultura de Calder, como forma de celebrar ese accidente y ese encuentro, y también como una forma de que la gente que pasa por la autopista sepa que está pasando algo especial ahí arriba. Y cuando se llega al borde del agua, como no se podía construir sobre ese muro de contención costero deteriorado, hicieron una especie de playa que hace que contiene a este muro.
Gracias. Entonces, advocates and allies, looking at the idea of peripheral vision to amplify our connection to each other. But that amplification really needs a loose fit. We need breathing room, even in places that are normally, efficient places of circulation. And sometimes that breathing room is from transforming something that existed into something else altogether by taking elements away. And at Cornell University, the College of Veterinary Medicine is very important. It is the most important College of Veterinary Medicine in the country, if not the world. They're setting the protocols in China right now for best practices for agriculture. And yet it was a building that grew opportunistically, because it's both a hospital, it's clinical research, it's classrooms and vivariums, and elements were added over time without ever a larger plan. And it became an incredible mess. And when we were invited to think about adding new classrooms for the growing classes, we said, maybe before we add something, we can take a few things away and create a place where the community can connect. And so we suggested taking down 4 buildings in the middle of this strange campus, and to create a place that we might actually see not only as this kind of fortress of not very good tall buildings and something that looked like a strange hotel arrival, but actually turn it into something that felt appropriate for the Academy of Cornell University. And so we reclad the research tower, and we opened up the public realm for a library, and then created a place of passage and landscape, a kind of water retention landscape, as the point of arrival. So before, it was really somewhat formidable, and after, you could say that we had a chance to create something more compelling by then taking what had been a back area that had been filled with strange buildings that we had removed, so that we could actually ascend now to a connected landscape. So it really is a landscape to landscape connection, and an indoor-outdoor world that's wood-lined and warm to connect on the right, those in the hospital, and on the left, those in the clinical labs. But thinking about what it means to convene and create a kind of soffit of connection and warmth in the place of Cornell, where it snows much of the academic year, became really an exercise in looking at the possibility of something that could also be acoustically perforated in this very hard surfaced area, and then also baffle that sound, because they were going to be using this for many sorts of events and conferences. And so while most of the time it is really enjoyed as a kind of a loose fit place for gathering, it is also a place where it can actually take the kind of high density traffic. And here you can see the acoustical wood and the fins handling sound, but offering an element of warmth. And from the upper level, this is the public level for the hospital. It too has a sense of being connected as opposed to disconnected, because from the hospital, you're really opening back your vista to the core of the campus. And that sense of vista for Kent State Center for Architecture and Environmental Design becomes very different in this case, not so much about removing, but actually looking back to the history of this area of Ohio where factories in many cases had been abandoned. And yet that idea of what these simple brick factories that had these kind of aerial lines of skylights was that they were great places of collaboration and production. And for us, this became a model for the College of Architecture and Environmental Design to have a sense of being a new kind of factory, or a factory where people could see each other. And in effect, whether it's one discipline after another or one year after another, not seeing them so much as hierarchically separate, but interconnected and woven together. So that section really became the expression then of this new form of a brick facade, really a kind of a curtain that clads this architecture school, where the upper level studio spaces are really this kind of crystalline lantern that at one end, which is very high, it reaches the datum of the city, and at the other end, which is lower, it's the datum of the campus. And so truly as a connector is one where you can see the city beyond. It is like a stacking Tiffany window, where the 24-hour life of the campus is something that comes into focus when we are inside, a parallel urban street that leads you from the cafe or the event space up to the studios. And within those studios, there is a sense of kind of panoramic connection and simplicity. And on the very first day, you could say they didn't know what to do other than to put their boards down and get started. But what's exciting for us is you can also see the review spaces on the right. They're acoustically independent, but visually connected. That at this very beginning time, there was a sense of infinite vista. And yet what we're happier with now is that there's infinite mess and creativity. And you could see beyond in the distance a review, a pinup in the review spaces, and then the kind of studios themselves in progress. And yet what's very interesting is that we were lucky enough to work with Belden Brick, a company that had effectively been in the area, and you could start to see the intimacy of that neighborhood. And we were able to repurpose the beehive kiln to do new things that had not done before. And you could see the color variation in this brick. They were somewhat apologetic about the diversity of colors, but we were really excited that this beehive kiln, a kind of ancient technology, would have one color on the outside of the kiln and another color just because of the way heat travels. And by adding one new element here, we worked with them to come up with a custom brick that extended out 4 inches. We could create a new tactile connector that would add a cadence and meter that would make this brick do something it had never done before, and ultimately become something that was at once abstract, but also simultaneously tactile. And so the idea then, another project here that is really devoted to breathing room is the Cornell Tech campus, which was invented to actually enable New York City to have a campus devoted to the future of technology and collaboration with industry. You can see the Morphosis building on the left, the Bloomberg Center, and on the right, this is our Tata Innovation Center. Now, what's interesting for us is this was a building we really wanted to see as something that would crack open the complexity of what data science and entrepreneurship could look like, and create a loose fit environment here where a kind of amphitheater of the outdoors and an elevated structure could avoid the risk of flooding because we're right on the river, and invite us into a place of collaboration. We were inspired by the Spanish Steps, one of the precedents that we shared at the Venice Biennale, where the idea of a kind of social convening could in fact create a more relaxed idea of what a lobby could be, so that you could be within eyesight at all times. Now, bringing it back again, we need to wind it back, because what we don't know is that it had a history that went back. And it was a history that was there for an institution for jails. It was a place of river-to-river views. It was a place that had an idea in a master plan of something quite wooden there that denied anything that had to do with it being on this unique site. So if you wind back, you can start to see the conceptual premise here was to crack open that strange planning diagram so that the river-to-river views and the escape from flooding, which I spoke about, would be the fundamental underpinning. And then the ascending idea of a kind of collaborative indoor campus would then indeed create the premise for this. So I repeat this just so you can see the kind of buildup or stacking, if you will, of these ideas, so that as we come into focus and look across and through, this idea of this topography that connects to the landscape also connects the community inside. And this is the master studio where the collaborative projects occur. And as they occur, what we're excited about is even at the tips, not like a building with 4 sides, but one with 8 corners, there are senses of intimacy in spite of the building being actually quite robust in scale. And that sense of ascent and connection is exactly where most places are trying to be very efficient. We wanted to be very inefficient so that collaboration could occur. And the gift of being in a setting like this with a commitment to sustainability is 22,000 square feet of solar panels, in this case, which we elevated, create a sheltered destination to actually look out and have views of the city. And so ultimately, it's that strange kind of collaboration with the infrastructure, the bridge beyond, that inspired this idea of a suspended building, which is enabling us to give as much over to landscape as we can, while we also create a column-free environment that is, in a sense, this whole place of loose fit and aspiration coming together in one structure. And that loose fit is also creating not only a public realm, but also a private realm that still has a sense of intimacy and connection to nature. So again,
sorry, let me chat with this, Marion.
Sure.
El primer proyecto es un edificio para la Facultad de Veterinaria de la Universidad de Cornell en Ítaca, que es la facultad de veterinaria más importante del país, que había sido construida a lo largo del tiempo, y ellos le dan una coherencia a este conjunto, cambiando el acceso, transformando el acceso en un pasaje, y generando un espacio interior, un paisaje interior que conecta el hospital y los laboratorios. Esto tiene un techo inclinado porque nieva mucho en Cornell durante todo el año académico, y todo está revestido y tratado con madera en el interior para que este lugar funcione acústicamente y pueda utilizarse para muchos programas. El segundo proyecto es una escuela de arquitectura, es la Escuela de Arquitectura y Diseño Medioambiental de Kent State, y trabaja sobre la idea de la fábrica y de las lucarnas. Entonces tiene una fachada de ladrillo para los pisos inferiores, donde hay aulas y laboratorios y oficinas, y los estudios son vidriados y tienen este escalonamiento que hace que todo se vea desde afuera y tenga una muestre de las 24 horas lo que va pasando dentro del edificio, y se genera en el interior también una vista infinita hacia abajo, que se fue transformando en un living infinito a medida que los lugares fueron siendo ocupados y usados por los alumnos. Y el último proyecto es el Tata Innovation Center, que toma esta tiene que elevarse por un tema de inundaciones, y está ubicado en Roosevelt Island y en el río Hudson, en el East River, perdón, y toma el master plan, lo parte en dos para establecer conexiones virtuales, y a partir de la necesidad de elevarse topográficamente, toma esta idea de la Piazza España de Roma, y continúa esta topografía en el interior para generar como los lugares de encuentro. Thank you, Marion.
Thank you, Tristan. So I'll continue with another urban project that's very nearby, the Tata Innovation Center, and it looks at contamination, flooding, and all those kinds of challenges that might actually still create a kind of public realm. And this is Hunters Point South Waterfront Park, and it's a place in many ways. If you could see at the very top of the drawing, you can see where the Tata Innovation Center is with the Queensboro Bridge. But as we come down the river, there's a place where more panoramic views are possible. And yet, if you look at the site, it was a contaminated industry site as we discovered it. And yet it had been a site of wetlands at one point, of great dynamic industry. And then in many ways, ultimately abandoned because industry moved out of New York City. It also was subject, just as I mentioned with the Tata Center, with flooding. And so as we start to think about what it means to build a public park, and in this case, it was a park that was built in advance of the largest urban development plan for affordable housing, our question was, how could we actually take this strange idiosyncratic water's edge and actually embrace flooding so that the temporal quality of sometimes dry and sometimes wet would not so much destroy or damage, but be part of the dynamic of the project. So you can start to see here in advance of any development, the Bloomberg administration in New York said, let's build something compelling so that developers who are taking some risk when they do affordable housing know that there's a valuable destination to make this compelling. You start to see here in the first phase, which was built 5 years before the second phase, we were excited about actually creating some legible destinations within this idiosyncratic edge and put into focus some things that could be universally understood, but also brought into focus, which was the horizon of Manhattan. And as we created this public green here, particularly it's a playing field for the school across the street, it's one where this single structure collected 4 different program requirements, restrooms, concessions, offices for the park, and also a shelter for the ferry terminal, that all of these could come together and become a new form of infrastructure, collecting sun light on the solar panels to power the lights in the park, and also descending down to collect the water to assist with irrigation. And as we look at that, it together frames this new public green. And invents a sidedness so that another side could actually host Water Taxi Beach's new form here, which is a kind of family beach. And yet, as we look at this sheltering sort of structure here of the pavilion, these views of the Chrysler Building in the distance are really pretty unique. And in some ways, we feel like the gift of being across from Manhattan is almost better than being in the city. And you see this as at dusk. And then you could see, in a sense, the promise of phase 2 were these strange landforms of hilltops, which were unusual. And we started to think, what would happen if we could have a multi-level park? And in this part here, we wondered if we could also restore the possibility of wetlands. And yet, as you remember, I showed the kind of fortified city at the beginning, that utopian, the ideal of protection, to keep something out. In this case, we created a fortified edge that could also help to keep something in, which is the success of these wetlands. And you can start to see that wetland landscape protected by this walk. In the distance, you can see the overlook. But what becomes super interesting about that fortification is that when the water level is high or when it's flooding, you have this sense of literally walking on water, which is something that you can do nowhere else in the city. And in fact, taking that funny peninsula of land and excavating it further to create more wetland area enabled us to create a bridge and Manhattan's private island, if you will, a private view of the city beyond. And that is really a kind of delicate landscape that looks at night in particular more magical than you can imagine. And yet what becomes very interesting for us is to think about this kind of multi-level experience that is at once civic in scale and much like a ship, if you will, looking out on the water, but also very private at the same time. And these are our drawings that we're really looking at this idea of both landform building, but also elevating from those landforms a new destination. We're lucky to work with shipbuilders up in Maine to create a structure that could be brought to the site, assembled, and then hoisted up, and literally finally land and form this incredible overlook, if you will, over the kind of wetland landscape in the fortified walk. And yet what we're as excited about in terms of the large-scale urban ideas, kind of intimate discoveries, welcoming the incredibly diverse communities in the city together as a place of discovery. And so you can start to see here a short film. What's intriguing for us is that it really is a place of exchange, as a place for the ferry stop, as a place for athletes to get together, as a place for school children to come and have meals, an inexpensive gymnasium, or in some cases, if you will, just a place where the willows that we planted on the wetland area and in these walkways are really new nature that had never been there, and yet will over time feel as if they have always been there. And this kind of simultaneity then of both infrastructure, urbanism, and protection are what come together in this particular view. And we're very excited that the Museum of Modern Art is going to be featuring this project in February in an exhibition that they have on New York's. So again, if we start to think about an upcoming project, though, we're very excited about the competition that we won not so long ago for the La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles. And if any of you have ever been to Los Angeles, you might know that tar is the defining nature of that city. Pleistocene era, more than 40,000 years ago, was the very oils that captured and preserved mastodons and mammoths is seen in contrast to the city of Los Angeles in a hurry to define its future. And so at the Page Museum, you can see this kind of strange set of fictional landscapes here showing how mammoths and mastodons got stuck in the tar pits. And because of that, their bones were preserved. And yet that image, if you will, which is fictional, is side by side with a real research site, because over 360 days a year, they're actively excavating this exact site to find the kind of legacy of our history. And that particular history is in storage and unseen. These dire wolves and mammoths and saber-toothed cats are the coolest things you could ever imagine seeing, and yet they're completely hidden. And so as we started to think of the earthwork that is the Page Museum itself, we started to think about this site as something that might connect the active research, the museum, and the culture of discovery, and think about the threads of Los Angeles's history and La Brea tar pits history as something that might be interwoven together. And so the strangeness of this site, some of you might recognize Zumthor's LACMA silhouette there in the lower left, said that if research is in the upper left, the community comes together in the central lawn, and this kind of strange fictional edge on Wilshire Boulevard comes together. If we could put into focus the distinctions of what happens here, of research and excavation, of community and convening at the museum, and of these kind of fictional landscapes, which have been in many movies as well, that what if we actually think about all of these in new and intensified ways, but fully interconnected? And so this idea of research and revelation, community and culture, spectacle and urban fictions becomes one continuous kilometer loop that actually enables this to be viewed as something that is a place of discovery of the Pleistocene, which was the era 2.5 million years ago, which is preserved, the Holocene 12,000 years ago, which has a kind of microclimate that we could amplify, and the Anthropocene, which is the present. And looking at those all together, this kind of tapestry of growing upon what has existed there, and expanding the museum, and also reaching out to Wilshire Boulevard, which is LA's Miracle Mile, and enable what had just been a barrier or a passage, or just a window into the park, to be one that could be a portal, almost like a construction fence portal, where we could actually imagine what it's like to enter the park. And in this case, actually come from the world of science or the kind of community engagement and carve open that berm to look into this place and actually reveal that hidden collection and shelter the research, which is actively underway at Pit 91, and expand the museum to have a kind of twin engagement so that exhibition now could complement research. And if we look at this phasable kind of rejuvenation and expansion, it really is the idea of this exhibition pit in the Pleistocene garden, taking what had been previously collected and hidden and enabling it to be something that we could actually access and discover in new and intimate ways and enable that sort of sense of excavation and revelation become something that joins the kind of active laboratory work that is literally happening within the museum. And then the kind of profound discovery that somehow this tar has fully protected these specimens so that we could discover new futures. And in fact, though, it's a community green and LA is starved for parks. And so what if this particular park is unique and special to what LA is so known for, which is telling us stories that are both fictional and real. And so that we might see that story of the Pleistocene kind of in motion in front of us, changing and almost like a drive-in movie becoming something that is super Hollywood. But not Hollywood, in fact, at all, because it's more real than any other part of LA. And as we cross the lake pit here, the idea of coming off of that urban street and be brought into the context of this place of discovery is really what we're very excited about. And we're working on the schematic design right now as we speak. And hopefully before the Olympics in Los Angeles, you'll be able to visit. So the last project here is really, and maybe Tristan, you want to capture this before I share the last one?
Yes, I will translate the Hunters Point Park. Es el parque de Hunters Point en Long Island City, enfrente de New York, en Queens. Y era un terreno industrial contaminado y abandonado. Y tenía el mismo problema de inundación que el proyecto del Data Research Center. Entonces, la idea era abrazar este problema de la inundación y generar una topografía que vaya cambiando con el tiempo a medida que el agua subía y bajaba. Entonces, dentro del proyecto tiene 2 etapas. Esta imagen es la segunda etapa, que tiene que ver con la idea de protección, como mostraba en la imagen del principio, pero no para mantener a alguien afuera, sino en este caso para mantener a alguien adentro, que es el paisaje del humedal y de la zona inundada, que genera esta sensación especial de estar como caminando sobre el agua, que es algo que no existe en ningún otro lugar de la ciudad. Y en la primera etapa estaba esa estructura que era curva y que tenía la particularidad de tener 4 programas distintos en una misma estructura, ¿no? Como idea de infraestructura, oficinas, locales, baños y un lugar de refugio para la gente que espera el ferry. Y el segundo proyecto es el proyecto del Page Museum en Los Ángeles. Tiene que ver con el paisaje original y con la historia del territorio. Este es el lugar donde se encontraron los mamuts, que eran los habitantes del lugar. Y entonces también fue creciendo el museo y propone hacer un loop continuo como idea de proyecto del parque y del territorio que involucre los distintos periodos históricos, los edificios de los distintos periodos históricos y los edificios de exhibición y de investigación. Y de esta manera, como que parte del recorrido son no solamente los hallazgos, sino la manera de trabajar de los investigadores y de la institución, y tiene que ver con Los Ángeles, ¿no? Con esta que es una ciudad que está hecha de contar historias que tienen que ver con la ficción y con lo real, y de esta manera el parque y el proyecto también como que cuentan esta historia que es una realidad y en cierto sentido una ficción a la vez. Thank you.
Gracias. So this last project is really weaving together this question of the improbability of a kind of a new infrastructure and architecture and landscape, creating a new public realm that never existed at the edge of the city for the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. And this is a Brooklyn Botanic Garden Visitor Center in conjunction with the Robert Wilson Overlook. And what's very precious in New York is that it's a city that has more density and paving than you can imagine. And yet there's a very special gem of a park, Brooklyn Botanic Garden, which is private, from the city, but accessible through this edge here, if you will, the kind of a strange parking lot. And yet, Olmsted, who did Prospect Park, which you can see to the left, is one where the idea of weaving paths around and through is to create a sense of infinite discovery within a finite landscape. And so the Brooklyn Botanic Garden is a very special landscape, but we started to think about what the visitor center might be because we didn't want something that would intrude in the garden, and yet we wanted something that would be a threshold between the city's edge and the beauty of the garden. So we played with origami and wondered about something that would at once be 100% urban and 100% natural. And if that could be seen at the threshold of this strange urban edge, and yet the beauty of the garden inside, if we could think of something that could move slowly and unfold just as much as Olmsted's paths were winding for discovery, we could begin to create something that would at once be a place of movement and inhabitation, but also a kind of dynamic chameleon section. At the very bottom, you could see it's 100% urban, and at the very top, it's 100% natural from city to garden. And this idea of a kind of cadence, if you will, almost a sectional ribcage of change, means that we could be welcomed from the urban edge here in a plaza that felt, at one hand, 100% urban. And as we start to pass through, dappled in light, a kind of a guiding light, if you will, to come into this place of selection between entering the city on the left or entering the garden on the right. And in some cases, these curves have to do some environmentally sensitive things, and we're following the drip line of this cherry tree to make sure that the building and its foundation never impact the growth of what's occurring in the garden. And inside the visitor center, we wanted it not to be enclosed, but to always be tempting you through transparency to join the experience of being in the garden. And yet, even where we need an event space, it is a two-sided room that is embedded in the hillside. And if you look to the upper left of the slide, you'll see that it really is embedded in the hillside, but enabling a public route above to look into the event space and through to the garden. That strange kind of topography, if you will, is lifted and elevated here. So that journey, if you will, from, say, the entry that's near the subway on the other side of the garden is one where you could actually pass through this elevated portion of the building. And that simultaneity of being 100% natural above and being part of the urban topography below is seen here in this kind of sectional moment that is at once a place of gathering and public engagement as it is a place of nature. The garden is very interested in really having every structure, whether it's natural or artificial, to be part of their ecosystem. And so the green roof runoff, the rain garden, and the transfer to the detention area are part of the systems. As they're on our new roof, they're a 10,000 square foot green roof, a kind of swath of meadow that is a new garden, if you will, that is experimental in nature. And you could see the kind of grasses. We spent a year experimenting with the garden on what might thrive on this green roof. And a few things thrive that were unexpected. In this case, you can start to see, in a sense, a new landscape, if you will, for nature. And yet, if we look at this building now, it really tips its way into the garden, just barely there as a sliver of engagement, luminous, if you will. And yet, if one was arriving from the subway, you might even miss the building. Now, this particular view led to a question, which is that at 23, 25 feet higher than the garden, the subway entry was not at all accessible to the garden. And in fact, we love this idea of not being accessible at all times and being visible here from, say, the Japanese garden. And yet, this whole idea of urban connectivity, which happened so easily on the major entry, happened less easily, if you will. This gives you just a little window here of this kind of construction of this particular roofscape. And you can start to see that it is really meant to be seen as a place of movement at all times and a place of change. And as a place of change, one where the upper landscapes and lower landscapes are equally valuable. So that kind of sectional topography or dynamism really came into question then as we went further into the garden. And there was a failing wall that had kinds of erosion. And if you look at the very top, that's where the subway entry is. And so there was no way a wheelchair could ever access the park with any kind of ease. There were suggestions for accessible ramps, and many of them were inspired by the ramps that we had at the subways in the city. And yet we thought, along with the garden, that there might be a new opportunity to think of a journey that would not be just an ADA ramp, but be in fact a 1,000-foot journey that could be an inhabitable garden. So one was never thinking about that wheelchair route as something that was a wheelchair route, but to think about a tapestry of a garden and a new experience that was part of arriving in the garden as one where you could see together that journey of the city and the garden being seen together. We got a grant from the Robert Wilson Foundation with the garden to create this new landscape. And what became very interesting for us was saying that rather than the eroded landscape, if we create these new retaining walls, we could at once create a journey or a walkway, but we could also simultaneously create a place where a garden could thrive. And that thriving, if you will, for us, particularly during the pandemic, when it became so clear to all of us in the city that we all needed room to breathe and we needed to be able to connect with nature. And for us, it was an incredible joy to see that this was, in a sense, when it first opened, one of the big destinations for the community to come together and to reconnect with nature and with each other. And so finally, I'll close with the words that, in fact, we are in many ways never working with pure sites any longer, particularly if we want to engage the public realm. And for us, it's really an honor and a gift to be able to be part of these urban projects that have larger aspirations beyond just being privatized, but in fact, connecting with a larger realm. So thank you.
Thank you, Marion. I will translate this last project. Es el centro de visitantes del Jardín Botánico de Brooklyn, que queda junto al Prospect Park, y Olmsted, que fue el diseñador del Prospect Park y del Central Park, había diseñado unos senderos como ondulantes por este parque. Y ellos, para armar la entrada del parque y el centro de visitantes, trabajaron con la idea de origami y con una transición de un edificio que fuera 100% urbano a 100% natural, a través de esta serie de cortes que se veían en las imágenes. Y lo que va guiando el recorrido es la luz, y las reglas tienen que ver de la forma con esquivar las raíces de los árboles, con las fundaciones del edificio, y el edificio pasa de ser totalmente urbano a ser un lugar de encuentro y un lugar de la naturaleza. Y un problema que tenían que resolver era el de la accesibilidad desde una estación de subte que quedaba en la parte de abajo de una pendiente. No había manera de que esa pendiente funcione para todo el mundo. Entonces, en vez de pensar como en una rampa con todas las reglas de rampa para discapacitados, piensan en un jardín ondulante, trampado, hecho a partir de muros de contención, y entonces este nuevo paisaje es un paisaje con pendientes mucho más suaves, que sí permite que todo el mundo lo pueda usar y pueda llegar. Thank you, Marion. This was really great. We saw really lots of projects, and we may have some questions, some of the students or the professors, and let me start with one question. You're talking about this breathing room and how the pandemic forced us to rethink this idea, and you have done many academic and office projects. And probably education and work have been the two aspects of life that have been more influenced by the pandemic or that suffered bigger changes. How do you think this is affecting these typologies of buildings now, or what are the changes that these kind of buildings are suffering now?
I think, Tristan, that's a very good question. I think what we have all learned with I both teach at the University of Pennsylvania, and I have my own office with my partner, Michael Manfredi. And I think people, when they think about places of work and places of learning, perhaps the most important ingredient is getting together and convening. And so you could argue that the kind of original paradigm of private offices and private places to work are something that we can easily reproduce at home. But what we can't reproduce is what it means to create a kind of community. And so it seems that our preoccupation with creating loose fits and not so constrained in some ways can accommodate those moments where we might need to be 6 feet apart, but still want to be together. And so I think our sense is that the idea of spaces being where we come together when we think about the workspace in universities is becoming even more foregrounded. And the kind of sense of individual privacy in the workplace is something that is maybe less emphatically important as we start to think about our priorities.
Yes. Para los estudiantes pueden escribir las preguntas que quieran en el chat de YouTube y se las leemos a Marion. Here we have a question about one of the students. I would like to ask what materials is the last project that you showed made out of the Botanical, the visitor center in Brooklyn? And how does vegetation and humidity affect that materiality?
It's a very good question. The building is structured in steel and concrete, and it's a white concrete, which comes from a Long Island sand, which is very nearby. And the idea of this white concrete is that it is something that will show weathering, and we want that weathering to be evident over time with humidity and the changes and to age. And the Robert Wilson Overlook is also a white concrete, but in that case, it is precast. So it could be fabricated during the long winters where you can't work with concrete on site, and then brought and assembled on the site. And the plant material that is complementing that is diverse, but really tested. And we worked with Toby Wolf, a wonderful landscape horticulturalist, who was using that as an opportunity to say that we're going to have an enduring mixed landscape. And that palette of plants that we select are plants that are diverse, so that if one of them starts to fail, the others can actually grow in. And so that's a dynamic materiality, which is the landscape palette, as opposed to the more static materiality of the architecture.
I will translate this because the question was in Spanish. So, ella trabaja con, es de hormigón y es de estructura metálica. El hormigón es un hormigón blanco que se hace con la arena de Long Island, que está ahí cerca, y eso hace que se vea mucho el proceso de envejecimiento y el paso del tiempo, ¿no? De envejecimiento, o sea, la pátina que se va generando sobre el material. Y el otro material importante es el de la cubierta verde, sobre el que hicieron muchos experimentos con las plantas, y tiene son distintos materiales que se van creciendo uno sobre el otro y se van reemplazando entre sí. If some of the professors want to open up a microphone and make a question, please feel free to do so. Or feel free to ask more questions in the chat, in the YouTube chat, in the case of the students. Anímense a preguntar todos. Your practice, I will ask another question. Your practice is, you work with really large-scale buildings and public parks. They're impressive projects, and they're widely published in the architectural media. Yet your practice, and I mean this as a praise, has a very local flavor. Like most of your projects are in the US, and this means that you have like I feel like they have a very close connection to other construction techniques and to the environmental constraints and to the specificity of planting and landscape. How do you feel about this? Did you have you showed the project of the Novartis Visitor Center, but how is working abroad different from working in the US to you, or how do you feel about this?
I think that it's, for us, we love the possibility of working abroad. particularly though when a place has values that we can learn about. I mean, it's an incredible adventure to find yourself in another country, working in another country. We're working right now on the US Embassy in New Delhi, India, a project that's under construction. The lecture focused, I didn't share that one because it's very much like La Brea, work in progress. Yet there we actually wanted to pull about the legacy of architecture and the legacy of landscape there before we actually began designing something very contemporary, so that we could draw from the specificity and the tactile invention that has been so powerful in India for centuries, and see what this new chapter might look like. So I think we feel very humble when we work in other countries and very excited about being able to learn about what will feel both compellingly timeless, but also forward-looking.
And what do you see as the biggest difficulties of working in the US? That would be the other side of the question.
The biggest difficulty of working in the US is I think that there's an incredible division between what happens in construction and what happens in design. And there has been an evolution of defense mechanisms that have made our drawing sets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and our specifications longer and longer and longer, because contractors are held to very strict budgets, and they need to find opportunities to acquire more money from an owner for certain things. And so it becomes a little bit more of a debate and more contentious than it ever should be. And I think we miss very much the idea of being able to have a very tight collaborative relationship with the folks who are actually building the projects, the subcontractors who are so important, because these layers of infrastructure during construction begin to pull apart the very goals and aspirations that forged the project in the first place.
Thank you. ¿Alguien tiene pregunta? Los estudiantes pueden escribir lo que quieran. Le la pregunta a Marion. O simplemente abran el micrófono los profesores y pregunten, si quieren conversar de algo más con Marion antes de cerrar. Okay, you left everybody speechless, so I think no, I'm getting messages on my phone, but they're not real questions, so I will read them later. I thought that somebody may be asking questions, but this was really great, Marion. We're really grateful that you took this time to share your projects, your ideas with us. The lecture was really fantastic because the projects are great works on one side, but also all the images, the videos, and all the discourse was great. And here, sorry, I have one last question. And Teresa is asking, they were discussing, because they're watching the lecture with the students all together, and discussing many references of botanical gardens. And they were wondering if you had any in mind when you designed the parks that you mentioned, such as the Jardín Botánico de Barcelona by Carlos Ferrater, or any other botanical gardens. Which are your influences in this territory?
You know, it's interesting, as we worked on parks and botanical gardens, our influences are actually much broader than just botanical gardens. We're inspired by many. I'll tell you one that we adore is the one in Oaxaca. But we're really looking broadly. In Seattle, we were quite inspired by the Louisiana Museum in Denmark. And that one, as it overlooked the water, was really a source of inspiration for us. And then with the botanical garden, we were looking very closely at Gaudi's Park Güell, which seemed to be a place of change and surprise and different engagements over a large terrain. But for us, I think it's really a broadcast appreciation for different narratives of engagement with gardens. And then we like to sort of take all that research and forget about it. And just start to think intuitively rather than referentially.
That is great, yes.
Teresa,
Okay.
I have question if you want. I'm sorry, my camera is
Sure.
not working. Hi, Marion. Very nice. So, sorry, my camera is not working right now. It was an amazing presentation. Thank you so much for committing like you did with the introduction, even speaking in Spanish. It was amazing. So thank you so much. I'm admiring very much your what I think or what I understood that are maybe two of your main inputs when you think about a project, like nature or the landscape, and how it's also urban or the city, or how the building interacts with the context. So I was thinking a little bit like, how much do you study, or how you study your previous context, if you feel like nature or your context or the landscape informs the building that you want to build, or if the building that you are designing, it's gonna, or how much is gonna modify that previous context, creating a new nature or a new landscape, or I mean, how these two things interact for you in a more theoretical point, I think.
I think, Agustina, that is a great question. And for us, I think we actually like architecture to take a back seat as long as it can. And meaning, think about architecture at first at all. We think about constructing a site. We think about constructing movement and flows. We think about constructing, in a sense, a place of destination, but also connection. And so if we can delay our understanding of what a site can be and construct that site first, then architecture will follow. And that's a very hard thing when buildings are big. But I found that when we start with architecture, we fail. We just keep on trying to do stuff, and the stuff never wants to land anywhere. But when we delay it and sort of understand what the requirements are and then put it away and forget about it, we can actually shape the site first, and then the architecture can find a home within that site.
Love your answer. Thank you so much. Tris, you're muted.
Thank you. I was speaking muted. Damian, one of the students, is asking for advice. What advice would you give an architecture student today?
You know, I think my advice for students today is the same advice I would have given 20 years ago. Travel. I think the most important thing is to travel, because when we travel, we might have a plan. We might think we know what we're looking for. We might have a clear agenda, but it's the things that we discover along the way that surprise us are the very, very things that shape and influence us in ways that are profound. It also enables us to meet people who are not like us, enable us to have conversations that give us empathy and engagement with cultures that are not our own. And so I would say, you know, as designers, we need to take in a very broad tapestry of considerations, and travel is the thing I would advise more than anything else.
Thank you, Marion. We'll end up with this beautiful reflection. So I love this. So thank you so much. It's been really great. And we were waiting for this opportunity for many years. So thanks to the pandemic, in a way that opened the possibility for these exchanges, we could finally hear you or have the opportunity to talk with you. So we're very happy about this, and we hope you can visit Buenos Aires sometime in the future, and we can meet personally, or maybe in New York. Maybe that's easier. But it's since you mentioned traveling, it's really a destination that I think it's really interesting, especially since you, after your research on Argentinian architecture and precedents and this mix of art and architecture. So we look forward to meeting you personally one day. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And I hope I can visit you all in person someday too. Amazing school and an amazing culture that has been inspiring, and I admire it a lot.
Thank you, Marion. Muchas gracias a todos.
Gracias. Hasta luego.